Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a different kind of history. One that creaks with wooden bed frames, rustles with linen sheets, and absolutely does not smell like roses. You're in a medieval bedchamber now, where intimacy isn't private, passion isn't guaranteed, and nothing, not even the mattress, is soft. Welcome to a world where desire tiptoes in on cold stone floors. Candles flicker uncertainly, and you're sharing your room with more people than you'd prefer. You probably won't survive this with your dignity or eyebrows intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. Drop your city and local hour in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fire crackles softly as you step into the chamber. It's not grand, not romantic. This is no Hollywood castle scene. The floors are uneven stone. There's one window, maybe two if you're lucky, and even then, covered with oiled parchment, not glass. The walls are bare or draped with rough cloth to keep out the chill. And the bed? A wooden frame, rope lattice sagging in the middle, covered with a straw-stuffed mattress that crunches every time you breathe. You stare at it, wondering where the magic is. But magic doesn't live here. Practicality does. The blankets are wool, the sheets unbleached linen, and the pillows, if they exist at all, are filled with feathers and jealousy-inducing status. Most people share the bed, not just with a partner, but with children, servants, or visiting guests. Imagine leaning in for a romantic moment while your cousin snored 2 feet away. Intimacy had an audience, whether you liked it or not. In wealthier households, you might find a canopy bed with thick curtains, more for warmth and privacy than style. Closing the bed curtains felt like entering a small world of your own. Behind them, there might be a flicker of romance, or just a lot of awkward shuffling in the dark. And yes, darkness was standard. Candles were expensive. Tallow stank. Oil lamps smoked. So if you were planning a romantic evening, it happened under flickering light or no light at all. Many people believed sex should happen only at night, in modesty, and preferably with as few visual details as possible. Scholars still argue whether this stemmed from religious morality, practical constraints, or just a shared sense that nobody wanted to see too much. You kneel beside a small wooden chest. Inside, a few personal items. A wooden comb, maybe a strip of embroidered ribbon. Not much. Privacy was rare even for the nobility. Servants came and went constantly. You didn't get alone time. You got stolen moments. And that's just the inside of the chamber. Outside, in smaller homes or peasant cottages, the idea of a separate bedroom didn't exist. Everyone slept in the same room. Parents, children, animals, sometimes even guests. Beds were shared or rotated. In some cases, the only thing separating the married corner from the rest of the room was a draped cloth or strategically stacked baskets. You imagine trying to flirt under those conditions, whispering sweet nothings while the family goat looks on, chewing judgmentally. Even for nobles, private chambers didn't mean locked doors and scented baths. There might be a guard sleeping just outside, a lady in waiting in the corner, a dog on the foot of the bed. Romantic tension was less about longing and more about logistics. But it wasn't all grim. You find a small carved box tucked beneath the bed, scented with lavender and thyme. Someone took time to make this space feel tender, maybe even beautiful. A place where lovers could reach across scratchy sheets and touch fingers in the dark, sharing something small and sacred. There were rituals, too. A warm stone placed under the covers, a whispered prayer, a mug of spiced wine. Intimacy wasn't rushed. It was woven into the rhythm of daily survival. You weren't just two people. You were warmth in a cold world. You were comfort in an age that rarely offered any. Still, the physical realities intruded. That straw mattress, it attracted lice. The bed ropes, they sagged, unless tightened regularly. The bedding, rarely washed. Hygiene wasn't sexy, but it mattered. Some people rubbed herbs onto their skin or chewed parsley to freshen their breath, but others didn't. And you can bet that on long winter nights, love often came wrapped in layers of wool and the vague scent of cabbage. You pause beside the fire, where a copper basin is set ready for a sponge bath. A rare luxury. Most medieval people didn't bathe daily or even weekly. So yes, sometimes love came with the whiff of garlic and goats, but sometimes that was part of the charm. You didn't expect perfection, you expected presence. And then there's the floor. Cold, uneven, and unforgiving. You step across it barefoot and wince. This wasn't a place where people casually undressed and strutted around in linen robes. You stripped down quickly, if at all, and dove beneath the covers. Many couples kept some clothing on, either for warmth or modesty. Some even believed full nudity tempted demons or weakened the soul. Others just didn't want to be cold. So here you are, in a room that is not silent, that is not private, that smells faintly of smoke and lavender and hay. You lie on a mattress that crunches every time you breathe. And beside you, maybe, just maybe, someone reaches for your hand beneath the covers, offers a small smile in the dark, and reminds you that even in a world this rough, there was tenderness. You stir before dawn, the chamber still cloaked in half shadow. The coals in the hearth have dulled to a slow orange flicker, and the chill is settling back in. You shift under the heavy wool blankets and glance across the room, not because you expect romance to be in full bloom, but because this is the moment so many medieval couples first faced each other. Married, possibly strangers, and now sharing a bed that doesn't squeak with love, it just squeaks. Welcome to the world of marriage first, feelings later. You sit up slowly, imagining what it would be like to meet your spouse at the altar for the first time, as was common in noble households. Marriages weren't built on affection or chemistry. They were arranged, brokered like trades, blessed like treaties, and signed with names on parchment, not hearts in notebooks. In fact, most noble couples didn't choose each other. Their families did. Marriages were tools, designed to cement alliances, secure land, merge wealth, and make sure no one went off and married the wrong cousin, again. Love was never the point. If it happened later, great. But you weren't waiting for sparks, you were waiting for livestock and political advantage. You step into a corridor lit by pale morning light, where an elderly steward tells you the dowry arrangements have just been finalized. Sheep, land, a half-dozen bolts of fine wool, and maybe a title. The bride is 16. The groom is 28. A typical age gap. He owns a keep, she owns a name. And tonight, they consummate the contract. Yes, that's the word. Consummation. The act wasn't just intimate, it was legally essential. A marriage wasn't valid in the eyes of church or law until it had been physically sealed. No one needed a passionate affair. They just needed proof that the bodies had touched and the arrangement was complete. Some records even describe witnesses listening outside the chamber door. A few included verbal confirmation. Yes, we did it, now leave. It wasn't romantic, it was administrative. Historians still argue whether this practice was common across all regions or just in the more wealth-obsessed pockets of medieval Europe. But there's no doubt, love was a luxury, not a requirement. You pass a painted screen showing a wedding feast. Candles, bread, wine, minstrels. Everyone smiles, except maybe the couple. They're seated together stiffly, barely touching. There's curiosity, but not connection. Tonight is their first night alone. First touch. First conversation that isn't scripted by protocol. Now, imagine that moment. You're a young woman, raised to obey and preserve your virtue. You've been warned, vaguely, that something will happen on the wedding night, but specifics rarely discussed. Mothers hinted, priests sermonized, but no one explained. And now, you're undressing in front of someone you barely know, in a room full of tapestries and prayers, while relatives wait downstairs to toast your success. Meanwhile, your husband is likely just as confused, possibly more so. Medieval texts for men offered little more than do your duty, don't be too lustful, and make an heir. Romance manuals were rare. Most advice focused on legal obligations, property, and managing the household. And so, two awkward humans meet under linen sheets and try their best. You trace a finger along a carved bedpost. It's been smoothed over by generations. Generations who had to learn each other the long way. Because affection wasn't expected on day one. You built it, slowly. Through morning greetings, shared meals, surviving winters together, intimacy grew like ivy. Slow, twisting, patient. In the countryside, things were different. Peasant couples often did marry for affection, eventually. But even they understood that survival came first. A strong partner meant help in the fields. A good match meant shared bread, not shared sonnets. And if feelings developed over time, that was the bonus. You pass a woman hanging laundry near the hearth. She's humming. Her husband appears behind her, touches her elbow, then vanishes again. No grand gestures, just small comforts. That's love, medieval style. The quiet kind. But not all matches softened. Some hardened. There were marriages forged in fear, not fondness. Women given to older men. Widows remarried for property. Teenage brides who barely knew their rights, if they had any. One record tells of a girl married at 12, bedded at 14, dead by 15. You pause. The air shifts. Not all love stories glow in candlelight. Still, not every union was doomed. You listen to a woman describing her husband as not cruel, not foolish, and mostly warm. That, in medieval terms, is practically a poem. And the men? Some wrote actual love letters, clumsy, tender, painfully sincere. A knight stationed far away signs his note, "Your most faithful," who kisses the ribbon you gave until his lips grow numb. Cute, slightly dramatic, but sweet. And when love did blossom, it could be fierce. Think of Heloise and Caballard, scandalous, philosophical, tragic. Their letters still breathe with longing. Think of peasant couples fined for over-closeness before marriage. Clearly they couldn't wait. Or queens who fell in love with poets, sneaking away from royal chambers just to hear them recite. Love existed. It just had to fight through layers of wool, ritual, and economic expectation. You return to the bed, its sheets slightly rumpled now. A candle burns low on the table. Somewhere, a couple who barely knew each other a week ago lies in silence, thinking, breathing, slowly becoming something more than signatures on parchment. Maybe they'll fall in love. Maybe not. But tonight, they start trying.
You step through a heavy oak door into a narrow hallway, its floor slick with worn rushes and its air thick with damp wool, candle soot, and something faintly floral. A servant brushes past you, eyes down, carrying a folded length of linen. You follow, curious, until you notice what's embroidered on the cloth. Initials. 2 sets. A marriage bed sheet. This next chapter doesn't come with hearts and violins. Instead, it comes with contracts and obligations. Let's talk about consent, power, and property. Because in the medieval world, getting married wasn't just about joining hearts or families, it was also about handing over control. Specifically, the woman's. You watch as a young bride kneels at the altar, hands trembling. The priest speaks of unity, faithfulness, divine purpose. But behind the pious words lies a legal transformation. Upon marriage, a woman became what's known in Latin as femme covert, covered woman. Her legal identity, her rights, even her body now fell under her husband's authority, not just symbolically, literally. A married woman could no longer own property independently. Her wages, if she had any, belonged to her husband. Even her dowry, unless carefully negotiated, was absorbed into his estate. And that included something else too, her physical consent. You sit by the window of a scribe's chamber as he copies out canon law. The parchment crackles beneath his fingers. According to church teaching, marital sex was not just permitted, it was expected. A husband had a right to his wife's body, and she in turn had a right to his. This mutual expectation was called the marital debt. Romantic, right? The idea was that both spouses owed each other sexual access, an obligation that was part legal, part spiritual. If one partner refused too often without cause, the other could petition the local court or priest. You picture that confession. Father, my wife says her back hurts again. Some women used it to their advantage. If a husband denied his wife without reason, she could argue he was failing his Christian duty. But let's be honest. In practice, the system rarely worked in her favor. Consent, as we understand it today, ongoing, enthusiastic, retractable, was a foreign concept in most medieval contexts. Scholars still argue whether marital rape was recognized at all. In many regions, it wasn't considered a legal offense because, well, how could a man violate what he already owned? That's not to say every marriage was abusive. Many couples found mutual affection, understanding, and even equality within their homes. But the legal scaffolding was clear. Men were the heads of households. Women were subjects. Sometimes loved, often valued, but still subjects. You pause in a cloistered garden where two women sit embroidering under a fig tree. One murmurs softly, "He lets me keep the profits from my chickens." The other replies, "Mine lets me sleep." These are not dramatic declarations, they're quiet calculations. Survival in soft tones. In some rare cases, women retained more control. A widow could own property, conduct business, even decline remarriage. Noble women with strong families could negotiate generous dower rights. In cities, some merchant wives ran shops, managed ledgers, and brokered deals in their husbands' names. But all of it, every inch of autonomy, required permission or loopholes. You walk past a table of court records. The ink is faded, but the details are clear. A husband accused his wife of denying him his bed. She said he smelled like cider and slept in his boots. The court ruled in his favor. Another case tells of a woman whose husband visited her too often. The priest's solution? More fasting, less touching. And then there's the matter of age. Girls could be married as young as 12, sometimes younger, depending on region and parental ambition. While consummation was often delayed until puberty, the potential for abuse loomed large. Some church officials condemned the practice. Others shrugged. You pass a bishop's letter that reads, "The union was lawful. The girl shall mature in time." Comforting. Men, meanwhile, were expected to wait until they could provide a home and income. For nobles, this could mean marrying at 30. For peasants, much sooner. In either case, the power dynamic leaned sharply in one direction. Still, not all women were passive. You meet a woman accused of placing herbs under her husband's pillow to dampen his appetite. She was fined, but not jailed. Another soaked her tunic in mint water to cool his humors. A few brave souls even fled. Desertion was rare, risky, but not unheard of. If a woman could prove cruelty, impotence, or abandonment, she might be granted a separation. Not a full divorce, those were exceptional, but legal room to breathe. Even nuns, sworn to celibacy, weren't immune to these questions. One abbess wrote sternly to Rome, requesting clarification. Must a married woman submit always, even with sickness? The reply? A gentle dodge. A wife should honor her husband as Christ the church. Thanks, that clears it up. But desire doesn't disappear just because rules are strict. Couples found ways to communicate, to negotiate. A headache here, a long pilgrimage there. Some turned to their faith for guidance. Others turned to folk remedies, charms, or subtle rituals. A sprig of rosemary tied to the bedpost, a whispered spell, a shared secret. You pass a carved bed frame with initials scratched into the wood, not just names, a phrase. Let no one enter uninvited. You wonder if it was a warning, a prayer, a boundary drawn in defiance. Because even here, where laws blur consent into duty and love into obedience, some people still claimed their space. Some people still said no.
You duck beneath a low wooden beam and step into a different kind of world. Gone are the velvet curtains and carved headboards. Here, the ceiling leaks when it rains. The beds are pallets on the floor. The sheets, if they exist, are coarsely woven wool. This is where the majority of medieval people lived, loved, and yes, figured out how to make do. Tonight, you're slipping into the straw-strewn homes and behind the hay bales to explore how peasants did it differently. You crouch near a hearth where smoke rises lazily from damp firewood. A woman stirs a pot while her husband sharpens a blade. Their children sleep nearby, curled against the wall, wrapped in the family's only spare blanket. There are no locked doors, no separate rooms. Privacy is a rumor, but desire, still alive. It just has to get creative. You step out into the cool evening air, following a pair of young lovers as they wander behind a barn. They glance over their shoulders, giggling, not just because they're infatuated, but because they know they're taking a risk. Premarital intimacy was frowned upon, of course, but it also happened, often. Folk traditions across rural Europe were filled with euphemisms for courtship: night visiting, bundling, keeping company. In some villages, it was common for a suitor to sleep beside a young woman, fully clothed, beneath layers of blankets. The idea was to foster emotional intimacy. Whether hands stayed folded under the covers, that's between them and the chickens. You find a hayloft that smells faintly of summer and secrets. These spaces weren't just for storage. They were for stories. More than one child was born 9 months after harvest season, when the fields were empty and the moon hung heavy over the countryside. Midwives knew. Grandmothers definitely knew. But as long as no scandal erupted, no one said much. And yet, scandal was always waiting. If a girl was found to be pregnant before marriage, her world shifted. Sometimes the man married her, sometimes he vanished. Sometimes she vanished, sent to live with distant relatives or cloistered in a convent for reflection. Historians still argue how harshly premarital sex was punished across regions. Some courts handed out fines. Others required public penance. In one town, a couple was paraded through the streets wearing tunics inside out. Humiliated, but not ruined. You sit at a rustic bench and watch two neighbors swap gossip. They laugh about the shepherd's daughter and the cobbler's boy found behind the bakehouse last week. She'll be making bannocks with a bump soon, one says. The other nods, or she'll pretend it's the baker's. No judgment, just weary humor. They've seen it all before. The church disapproved, of course. Sermons warned against fornication, emphasizing that it led to eternal fire and earthly shame. But the priests weren't always consistent. A few quietly blessed informal unions. Others looked the other way if the harvest was good and the bride had a dowry waiting. And sometimes these unions were informal. Peasant marriages didn't always involve priests or paperwork. A couple might declare themselves wed in front of witnesses, share a meal, and move in together. The church tried to regulate this, especially by the later Middle Ages, but enforcement was patchy. In some villages, jumping the broom wasn't just a myth, it was the marriage. Which meant, of course, that breaking up was messy. Without legal documentation, dissolving a relationship could turn into a shouting match in the fields or a brawl at the tavern. You overhear a woman telling her friend, "He left with my blanket and my best spoon." No lawyers, no settlement, just hurt feelings and empty bedding. Still, love existed. You hear it in lullabies, see it in shared loaves, feel it in the way a husband lays his coat across a muddy path so his wife's shoes stay clean. These were not poetic declarations carved into tree trunks. These were practical acts of tenderness. One French story tells of a woman who buried her lover's comb beneath her doorstep so his spirit would never stray far. Another ground wildflowers into her soap to make her skin smell like the hillside where they first kissed. Folk magic? Maybe. Or just folk monging. You walk into a cottage just in time to see a couple curling into each other on their straw mat. The children are asleep, the fire is out, the wind taps softly on the shutters. It's not glamorous. Their feet are calloused, their hands cramped, but the way she tucks his hair behind his ear, that's Love Medieval Edition. And for those not in couples, there were still possibilities. Some widows shared homes and sometimes beds with each other for companionship and security. Bachelors worked long days and found comfort where they could, sometimes at taverns, sometimes with traveling performers, sometimes under the stars. One man, local legend says, serenaded his favorite pig until someone introduced him to a weaver's daughter. The story ends with wedding bells. Probably. Then there were seasonal patterns. Spring, with its warm breezes and longer days, brought new energy and often new romances. Midsummer nights were famous for mischief. Winter kept people indoors, close, warm, sometimes too warm. You step into a house with 5 people sharing one bed and wonder how did anyone find room to move, much less flirt. But they did. With a whisper, a touch, a shared jug of cider and a wink. Because even without privacy, wealth, or silk bedding, peasants still loved, still longed, and still found ways to be human in a world that rarely gave them softness. And when they did, they held on to it. You find yourself drifting through a churchyard now. Its stones slick with moss, the air thick with incense and stern silence. A bell tolls in the distance, echoing across the cloistered walls. Inside the cathedral, candles flicker beneath stained glass saints. You step through a carved doorway and feel the air change. Denser, older, more judgmental. Because tonight, you're stepping into the most powerful bedroom of all, the pulpit. Let's talk about how the church says no, but also maybe. You tiptoe past rows of wooden pews, worn smooth by centuries of knees and confessions. The priest's voice hums through the nave, echoing warnings about sin, lust, and fleshly corruption. You sit quietly, hands folded, pretending not to notice the young couple 2 rows ahead exchanging glances. Forbidden glances, nervous glances, very normal glances. See, the church in medieval Europe had a lot to say about intimacy, and most of it boiled down to this: only within marriage, only for procreation, only when absolutely necessary. Romantic, right? But here's where it gets more confusing. For all the strictures, the lists, the rules chiseled into canon law, there were also loopholes, quiet ones, cultural ones you could slip through if you were clever or lucky.
You pass the lectern where a priest has left his copy of Decretum Gratiani, a sprawling legal guide for the devout and the desperate. Inside are entire sections devoted to what kind of sex is allowed and when. For example, sex on holy days, generally discouraged. Sex during Lent or Advent, definitely not. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, questionable. During a woman's period, no. While pregnant, debatable. After childbirth, wait at least 40 days. You do the math and realize that leaves not much. One friar joked that married couples had about 90 licit nights a year, assuming no illness, or fasting, or penance, or travel. And of course, it had to be in the missionary position. Anything else was considered unnatural, even sinful. Historians still argue whether enforcement was consistent or mostly symbolic. Some communities took it very seriously. Others nodded along, then went home and did what they pleased. You walk past the confessional now, its curtain slightly ajar. A young man kneels on one side, mumbling about impure thoughts. The priest listens, offers a sigh, recommends fasting and 2 Our Fathers, then adds, almost kindly, avoid cheese before bed. It stirs the blood. Medieval advice, part moral, part dietary. Because in this world, the body was a battlefield. Flesh was dangerous. Pleasure, especially unregulated pleasure, was deeply suspicious. The church taught that even within marriage, desire could corrupt. You weren't supposed to want sex. You were supposed to endure it, willingly, quietly, like a good Christian. Which raises the question, how did anyone enjoy anything? You step into the scriptorium, where a monk scribbles away copying a treatise from St. Jerome, who claimed that nothing is so unclean as the body. Across the hall, however, another monk is illuminating a manuscript, adding a small drawing of a naked man fighting a snail in the margins. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. It's human. Because the church wasn't a monolith. While high-ranking bishops wrote scathing condemnations of lust, village priests often turned a blind eye to common sense. They baptized babies born out of wedlock. They listened patiently to marital complaints. They performed secret blessings for couples not yet married. Some were harsh, others were gentle, and some, as records show, weren't exactly celibate themselves. One particularly bold nun was caught with the love letter hidden in her psalter, while a bishop in the 12th century France kept a mistress and 7 children in a house just outside the city walls. These weren't isolated cases. Monasteries and convents had reputations, not always deserved, but often whispered about. You peek into a cloister garden, where a young novice glances nervously at a passing visitor. Their fingers brush, just for a moment. A sin? Maybe. A memory? Definitely. And for lay people, things weren't much easier. You passed a woman kneeling before a statue of Mary, asking for forgiveness, not because she loved wrongly, but because she loved first, before her marriage, before permission. She knows she'll confess again, knows the cycle: sin, sorrow, forgiveness, relief. Then a few weeks later, the same longing returns. Some scholars believe this constant moral tension created a kind of psychological intimacy. People knew their urges were natural, but they'd been told to feel guilt anyway. That guilt, repeated in rituals of confession and penance, created space for reflection and, ironically, closeness to God, to each other, even to the priest. Still, not everyone stayed silent. You find a letter tucked between the pages of a psalm book. A woman writes to her confessor asking if it's sinful to enjoy her husband's touch. He replies, "So long as your soul does not lead your body, but they walk together, there is no shame." That priest was eventually transferred, but the letter survived. because there were cracks in the rules, spaces where real people slipped through, awkward, aroused, ashamed, and utterly sincere. The church told them to be afraid, to moderate, to suppress. And many tried. They lit candles, they prayed, they fasted. But at the end of the day, they were still human. They still looked at each other across market stalls and meadows, still touched hands under cloaks, still dreamed. Because even when the church said no, desire found a way to whisper maybe.
You're back in the village now. Smoke curls from chimney tops, a rooster crows far too early, a dog trots across a muddy path. You pass a cottage window just as a young couple begins to stir under their shared blanket. They exchange a smile, then pause. It's Wednesday, and it's Lent, which means, according to church rules, no intimacy allowed. Because in medieval life, it wasn't just what you did that mattered, it was when. Welcome to a world of holy days and bedroom delays. You step into a quiet kitchen, where a woman kneads rye bread with a kind of frustrated focus. She glances toward her husband and mutters, "Too many saints, not enough nights." He smirks, but doesn't argue. They both know the calendar is packed not just with shores and feast days, but with rules about when you could and couldn't be close. The medieval church imposed restrictions on sexual activity during certain seasons, days, and even times of day. These rules weren't random. They were deeply entwined with religious beliefs about purity, discipline, and the sacredness of particular times. You weren't just avoiding sin, you were aligning your body with the divine rhythm of the year. The big blackout periods? Lent and Advent. That's roughly 80 days a year, nearly 3 months where marital sex was supposed to be off the table entirely. Holy Week? No. The days leading up to major feasts like Christmas or Easter? Also no. Fridays, being the day of Christ's crucifixion? Better not. Sundays, technically a day of rest. And not that kind of rest. You start doing the math again. One scholar's estimate puts the total number of off-limits days around half the year. Historians still argue whether these bans were widely enforced or just pious theory. But in many communities, they shaped behavior, even if they were bent more often than obeyed. You walk through the nave of a church and listen to a homily. The priest reads a list of prohibited days aloud, his tone solemn. Let the faithful refrain during times of penance. Let the flesh be tamed, let the soul rise higher. A man coughs loudly, a woman stifles a laugh. Because let's be honest, people were people. While some devout couples followed the rules to the letter, many found ways around them. A few abstained outwardly but met in secret. Others confessed and simply did it all over again. Still, guilt lingered. You stop by a confession booth where a husband admits to breaking a fast night with affection. The priest sighs, then assigns penance, a week of no meat, extra prayers, and sleep in separate beds. The man nods solemnly, then walks straight back to the tavern. And then there were the saints. Lots of saints. Every day on the medieval calendar was marked by one or more saints' feast days. Some were celebratory, others more solemn. Many people avoided intimacy on major feast days out of respect or superstition. You didn't want Saint Margaret watching you from the sky with disapproval, or worse, Saint Jerome, who hated the body almost as much as he hated women. You peek into a bedroom where a wife hangs a small painted icon above the bed, Saint Agnes, the Virgin Martyr. Her eyes look downward, politely avoiding whatever might happen beneath. But the symbolism is clear. Holiness was always watching. And yet, so were the neighbors. In tight-knit villages, everyone knew everyone else's habits. If a couple got too cozy during Lent, it might become the subject of local gossip. "She's baking bread twice a day now," one woman says pointedly. "Must be more than just flour rising." You raise your eyebrow. Subtle. In cities, things were looser. Wealthier households had more privacy and more distractions. But even there, expectations lingered. Some noble women reportedly marked their calendars with beads or knots to track acceptable nights. Others relied on confessional advice or discreet notes from confessors who may or may not have followed their own guidance. You pass a monk in a garden, tending herbs. He pauses to mutter, "Desire should sleep during holy days." Then he slips something into his robe pocket. A letter? A token? Something he shouldn't have? You decide not to ask. For some couples, abstaining during certain seasons actually heightened their connection. The anticipation, the waiting, the tension under woolen blankets, just not touching. A kind of slow burning affection wrapped in ritual, maybe even romantic in a very, very patient way. But not everyone waited. Some turned to folk remedies and local superstition to cleanse the soul before and after breaking the rules. You spot a charm buried beneath a cottage threshold, a scrap of linen tied with rosemary, mint, and a pin, meant to close the body to sin, or maybe just to ward off judgmental neighbors. Others sought forgiveness quickly. A brisk confession, a token penance, and back to bed. After all, sin loses its sting when it becomes routine. Then there were travelers, pilgrims, soldiers, merchants on the road. For them, the church's calendar was more suggestion than structure. In distant inns and roadside shrines, the rules faded, especially if no one knew your name. One story tells of a man who claimed to be celibate every Lent. In his own town, elsewhere, he was just visiting. You return to the village square, where a couple dances slowly to the hum of a lute. It's the eve of a feast day. There's wine, laughter, soft candlelight. But just as the mood warms, someone rings the chapel bell. It's midnight. The feast has begun, which means, technically, no touching. They sigh, hold hands, step apart. And maybe
You duck through a narrow doorway, low enough that you have to stoop. The air shifts, warmer now, more familiar. Somewhere, bread bakes. A dog snores under a bench. You step into a medieval sleeping space, and this time, it isn't draped in tapestries or guarded by servants. It's practical, it's lived in, and it's crowded. Because before you can even think about what's happening under the blankets, let's talk about the fact that beds were crowded. Literally. You glance at the lumpy mattress near the hearth. It's made of straw wrapped in coarse linen, flattened into soft valleys over time. But what really catches your eye is the number of people tangled in it. A married couple, 2 children, and possibly, depending on how long they've been visiting, a cousin or a widowed aunt who needed a place to stay. And this was normal, especially for the poor. In a one-room cottage, you slept where you could, and often you slept together. Not just because of space, but because of warmth. Body heat was a real survival tool during long winters. So everyone piled in. Siblings, grandparents, toddlers, sometimes even the goat if the frost was bad enough. Which meant privacy was, well, not a thing. You sit in the corner of the room as evening falls and the family begins their nightly routine. Boots off, coats hung, blankets fluffed. No doors closed behind them, no curtains drawn. This isn't just a shared bed, it's a shared life. You try to imagine being newly married and spending your first night beside your in-laws. Romantic? Not exactly. But intimacy was expected to grow not from seclusion, but from cooperation, from patience, from a sense of humor. And things didn't get much more spacious up the social ladder. In noble households, beds were larger, yes, but the idea of a private bedroom still wasn't universal. Servants slept in the same chamber as their masters. Ladies in waiting lingered in corners, ready to fetch water or braid hair. Guards stood outside the door, sometimes inside it. You look at a grand bed with 4 posters and heavy curtains, not just for decoration, but because of keeping out noise, light, and very often, other people. Historians still argue whether these arrangements discouraged intimacy or simply taught people to ignore what wasn't their business. In some castles, the lady of the house slept with a small entourage. In others, children or wards shared the space. A noble couple might whisper beneath their canopy while 3 apprentices snored 12 feet away. You pass a doorway and peek into a farmhouse where a couple lies face to face, noses nearly touching. They're surrounded by their children. It's not ideal, but it's affectionate. The children are used to the closeness. The couple has learned to speak in glances, to steal moments, a touch beneath the blanket, a kiss when the others aren't looking. And then there were the travelers. You find yourself in a roadside inn now, smoky, noisy, full of strangers. Here, beds were for rent, but not always private. In smaller inns, it was common for multiple guests, strangers, to share the same mattress. Hot bedding, they called it. One person would sleep while another worked the night shift, and they'd switch. Or worse, 2 would share at the same time, often with feet pointed in different directions. You pause beside one such bed. 2 men are already in it. They've never met. They grunt greetings, pull the covers tight, and roll away from each other. You wonder how many awkward toe collisions it takes before sleep finally arrives. And of course, there were rules. Unwritten ones mostly. Where to lie, when to move, how to signal that you were not interested in conversation or cuddling. A turn of the shoulder, a cough, a muttered prayer. For couples, it meant learning a dance of timing, waiting for others to sleep, or feigning sleep to gain a few moments of peace. There's a sweet and slightly absurd record of a young couple who tried to create privacy by pretending to be asleep under the covers while gently nudging the family dog out of the way with their feet. The dog was apparently not amused. But despite the crowding, despite the noise and the smells and the snoring, people made it work, because they had to. And maybe, just maybe, it made them cherish those rare quiet moments even more. You peek into a merchant's home where a curtain divides the room. On one side, a grandmother and 2 children, snoring gently. On the other, the couple, sitting close. They're speaking softly, heads bowed. You can't hear the words, but you can feel the warmth between them. It's not about passion, it's about presence. In a world where nothing is truly yours, not space, not silence, they still have each other. One fringe story tells of a carpenter who built a false panel into his sleeping platform, just large enough for 2 people to slip away unnoticed. Another speaks of lovers sneaking into barns, not for secrecy from society, but from their own families. Because even in a society where everyone slept together figuratively, humans still longed for that private, hushed, you and me only space. And when they couldn't find it, they whispered anyway. Beneath blankets, behind curtains, in shared beds, with the baby snoring at their feet and the cousin muttering in his sleep. Because love isn't always about perfect timing or candlelight. Sometimes it's about waiting for the others to drift off and then reaching out under the wool and straw to find a hand in the dark.
The wind whistles gently across the fields as you follow a narrow footpath toward a thatched roof cottage, your boots crunching soft dirt, the night sky pricked with stars. You pass under the arch of a garden gate where someone's left a basket of apples and a single red ribbon tied around the handle. It's not a fruit offering, it's a signal. Tonight, you're venturing into the world of premarital practice and village justice, a time when love before marriage wasn't just frowned upon, it was often punished, sometimes publicly, occasionally absurdly. You knock lightly on the cottage door, but no one answers. Then you hear soft laughter from the barn. You peek through a crack between the planks and spot 2 teenagers wrapped in a blanket, whispering, giggling, hands fidgeting, boots kicked off. They're not married, not even engaged, but they are, as the records used to say, in the habit of lying together. And that habit carried consequences. In many parts of medieval Europe, communities kept close watch on courtship behavior. There were rules, some formal, some just social code, that dictated when and how young people could express affection. Holding hands? Harmless. Kissing in the hayloft? Questionable. Anything more? Better hope no one saw you. But people did see you. Villages were tight-knit. Privacy was a luxury few had. So if a young couple got too close too soon, there was always a witness. An old aunt peering through the shutters, a younger sibling bribed into tattling, or a nosy neighbor who just happened to be walking past the hedgerow. You find yourself now at a manorial court session where a red-faced boy stammers his way through a confession. He visited his sweetheart 4 nights last week, always after dark, always under the pretense of discussing chickens. The steward raises an eyebrow. And what did the chickens have to say? The boy is fined a small sum, and both are ordered to perform public penance, standing outside the church after Mass, barefoot, holding a taper. Not exactly a walk of shame, but not far off either. Historians still argue how widespread such punishments were, and whether they were more about control or morality. Either way, they made their point. You could court, you could flirt, but take things too far, and the whole village got involved. That's where bundling comes in. In some areas, especially rural England and parts of the Low Countries, it was customary for courting couples to share a bed, fully clothed, under strict conditions. Often, a wooden board called a bundling board was placed between them, acting as a kind of medieval chastity moat. You picture the scene. 2 young people lying side by side, whispering, maybe holding hands, sometimes with the girl's parents in the next room, or the room with them. Cozy. Of course, not everyone respected the board, and sometimes the board wasn't even there. In one particularly revealing account, a mother caught her daughter entangled with her suitor and shouted, "That's not bundling, that's barnyard." If pregnancy occurred outside of marriage, and it often did, things got even trickier. Sometimes the couple married quickly, a shotgun wedding, centuries before the shotgun. Other times they were fined, made to confess publicly, or required to stand before the altar in plain clothes. In severe cases, if the man refused responsibility, the woman might be labeled unchaste, and her marriage prospects could vanish overnight. One story tells of a girl whose fiancé broke off the engagement when she became pregnant. The village, taking her side, refused to serve him at market for an entire season. That's one way to run someone out of town, with cabbage and cold shoulders. But not all these tales end badly. Many couples used the premarital practice period to test compatibility, emotionally, practically, physically. In fact, some scholars suggest that medieval peasants were far more pragmatic about intimacy than we assume. You're not likely to marry someone you haven't touched after all. At least, not unless land is involved. You sit beneath an old oak tree, as a grandmother tells a tale from her youth, how she and her betrothed used to meet at the river's bend, hidden by tall grass and moonlight. She says, "We weren't saints, but we knew what we wanted." She lifts her mug, you lift yours. Respect. Sometimes the community turned a blind eye. If a couple was heading toward marriage anyway, the elders might quietly accept an early pregnancy. There was even a saying, "Better a cradle at the altar than a lie in the cradle." Brutal, but oddly progressive. And in some regions, custom allowed for hand fasting, a kind of informal betrothal that could include sexual relations. These couples were considered morally bound, even if not yet formally wed. Think of it as a medieval, "we're basically married" status. Still, judgment came fast if that status wasn't clear. You pass a market stall where 2 old women gossip about the blacksmith's daughter. "Seen in the orchard again," one says. "Hair all tangled," the other tusks. "She'll be at the altar or the stocks before summer." Because the consequences weren't just personal, they were public. If your behavior hinted at impropriety, you risked reputation, marriageability, and in some cases, literal punishment. Stocks, fines, or the dreaded scold's brittle, a metal mask used to shame gossips and loose women. Even the men weren't off the hook.
A boy who got too many girls in trouble might find himself banned from courtship entirely. One tale tells of a village that forced such a lad to wear a chicken feather cap for a week. He never showed his face again. But despite the judgment, the risk, the rituals, love happened. People met, fell hard, bent the rules, hid behind barns, shared blankets, whispered things they shouldn't have. And sometimes it all ended in a scandal. And sometimes it ended in a wedding, just a little earlier than planned.
You wander along the edge of a twilight-lit village, where chimney smoke curls like soft ribbons into the sky, and the scent of peat and baking onions drifts over garden fences. You stop by a weathered stone wall and notice something curious: a small bouquet of herbs, lavender, fennel, and yarrow, tied together with a strand of flax. It's not decoration. It's a love charm. Tonight, you're stepping softly into the secretive, superstition-filled world of folk magic, fertility tricks, and bedroom beliefs, where not everything that happened between the sheets had to be explained by nature or desire. Sometimes it was sorcery, or at least a very hopeful recipe. You duck inside a midwife's cottage. It smells of dried rosemary and beeswax. She's stirring a pot of something thick and fragrant while muttering a rhyme under her breath. On a shelf behind her, bottles are labeled not with names, but with outcomes. To sweeten the heart, for male courage, to awaken heat. In medieval Europe, especially outside the church's strict walls, people had their own systems of belief. Love, lust, fertility, and satisfaction weren't just physical acts. They were influenced by the moon, by the seasons, by food, and most definitely by plants. Take fennel, said to stoke affection, or lovage, which was used in bath water to make the bather irresistibly appealing, or parsley, yes, parsley, which was thought to encourage conception if tucked into a bride's shoe. One record even mentions a bride eating a raw onion before bed to guarantee twin sons. Historians still argue whether that worked. Spoiler, it didn't. And then there were love potions. You find one being brewed now, a mix of wine, honey, a bit of sage, and the oil of marjoram. Drink this, the healer says, and your husband will find you as tempting as a roast goose. Not exactly perfume ad copy, but hey, roast goose was a delicacy. Some of these potions were symbolic. Others included animal parts, or more questionable ingredients. Crocodile dung was used in ancient times, though less so in medieval Europe, unless someone was really trying to show off. But still, powdered deer antler, dried beetle shells, bits of bone, all made appearances in love magic manuals. Of course, the church hated all of this. Folk love magic was considered dangerous, not just morally, but spiritually. Using charms to inspire desire walked a fine line with heresy. If caught, a woman might be accused of witchcraft. If lucky, she'd be fined. If unlucky, well, medieval justice wasn't known for its light touch. Still, people persisted, because there were deeper fears beneath all the herbs and whispers. Fertility, performance, passion, and most of all, control. In a world where many women had no say over who they married, love charms were sometimes the only agency they had. A dried apple slice buried under the doorstep of a desired suitor. A ribbon passed through bath water 3 times and then slipped into a man's coat pocket. A certain kind of knot tied while repeating a name aloud at midnight. Were they magic? Maybe. Were they desperation? Definitely. Men had their own tricks. One bachelor in Yorkshire wore a belt made of fox fur to stiffen resolve.
Another drank nettle tea to bring heat to the limbs. Whether it worked or just caused irritation remains unclear. And then there were fertility beliefs, many of them. You sit at the edge of a straw mattress where a woman lies with her hands on her belly. Her mother-in-law murmurs advice. Keep your feet warm, sleep with rosemary in your pillow, and avoid cheese during a full moon. You smile. The science is shaky, but the intent is strong. Certain foods were said to help with conception. Honey, almonds, figs, and fish. Others were to be avoided entirely, like beans, which were thought to clog the womb, or overly salted meats. Some couples avoided intimacy during thunderstorms because it was believed a child might be born with a stormy nature. One manuscript even warns against intercourse during eclipses. Children born in shadow shall not walk straight. You pause. Shadow children? That's new. You step into another cottage where a newlywed couple shares a strange custom. On their first night together, they're fed eggs cooked in the bride's own apron, a tradition meant to symbolize fertility, domesticity, and honestly, very questionable food safety. But even in noble households, these beliefs lingered. Queens carried fertility charms sewn into their bodices. Herbal baths were drawn before important air-making nights. One French countess reportedly slept with a small statue of Saint Anne under her pillow, just in case the Virgin Mary's mother could nudge things along. Sometimes, the charms weren't even about fertility. They were about keeping the spark alive. You pass a merchant's wife lighting a beeswax candle carved with her husband's initials. She whispers a blessing over it each Thursday, hoping he stays interested. Another woman sings a lullaby into her comb every morning, brushing her hair slowly so the spell of sweetness remains. And some tricks were more physical. One record describes a woman who sprinkled cinnamon oil onto her thighs because it made her feel warm and pleasing. Another dipped her toes in wine to invite kisses downward. You don't ask questions. You just file that under experimental enthusiasm. Were these acts effective? Maybe not in the way we think, but they mattered. They gave people, especially women, rituals, tools, something to believe in when the rest of the world gave them so little choice. Because in a world where love was arranged, consent was conditional, and beds were crowded with in-laws, sometimes the only freedom was a ribbon tied to a gate, a charm buried in the garden, a whispered rhyme beneath the breath. You leave the healer's cottage now. The sky has deepened into velvet. Somewhere, a couple curls into each other under a blanket scented with crushed thyme. Maybe they drank the potion. Maybe it was just the candlelight. But either way, they're smiling. And that's a kind of magic all its own.
The fog settles low across the fields as you make your way back toward the village square. The wooden beams of the guild hall groan under the weight of centuries. Above you, a weather vane squeaks in slow circles. Tonight's breeze carries something new. Less fragrant herbs and honeyed potions, more beer breath and old shoes. Because you're about to step into the world of public shame, rude songs, and medieval sex jokes, where everything private somehow found its way into the most public spaces. You sit at the edge of a long wooden bench as the tavern begins to fill. Tankards clink. A fiddler tunes his strings. A woman bursts into laughter so hearty it rattles the windows. Across the room, two farmhands are locked in a heated argument about whether a pig can count as a witness to marriage. You assume they're joking. You hope. Because humor was everywhere in the medieval world, even about sex, especially about sex.
Let's get one thing clear. People in the Middle Ages had senses of humor just as bawdy as any modern sitcom writer. They made jokes, told riddles, sang songs that would make a nun faint. Not in spite of their hard lives, but because of them. Laughter was a kind of armor. Take, for example, the tradition of charivari. You wander into a small village where a noisy parade is forming. Pots and pans bang together. A boy in a pig mask dances around with a wooden spoon. A man, poor soul, is being led through the square riding backward on a donkey. Why? He married a much older woman. Or maybe she was known to rule the bed. Either way, the crowd isn't letting it go. Charivari, also called rough music, was a kind of folk justice. Loud, mocking, and often directed at couples whose sexual behavior didn't match the community's expectations. Marrying too soon after a spouse's death? Expect a charivari. Caught cheating? Charivari. Suspected of being too frisky? Definitely charivari. The goal wasn't punishment. It was public embarrassment. The sound, the laughter, the insults, they were meant to shame you straight. Whether that worked is anyone's guess. You step into a bakery where two women knead dough and trade barbs. One says, "My husband's bread never rises." The other fires back, "Maybe he needs warmer hands." They cackle. Rude? Sure, but these jokes served a purpose. They were code, pressure release, community glue. And then there were the songs. Minstrels, tavern goers, even shepherds had their own dirty ditties. You pass a man singing a tune about a milkmaid and a slippery eel. Use your imagination. These songs were full of innuendo, double meanings, and bodily references that might sound crude today, but were absolutely par for the medieval course. One French song, sung cheerfully by traveling entertainers, involved a monk who tried to bless a maiden in ways the church most certainly did not approve. Another English ballad speaks of a farmer who plowed her field thrice before sunrise. Subtle. Historians still argue whether these jokes reflect real social freedom or just a way to mock the powerless. But what's clear is that humor gave people a space to talk about intimacy without talking about intimacy. It gave them metaphors, stories, punchlines. And when the jokes weren't enough, there were the curses. You walk past a carpenter muttering under his breath after stubbing his toe, "By St. Wilbur's breeches, may your staff wilt like week-old celery." Colorful, oddly specific. Medieval people didn't hold back. Insults often attacked masculinity, potency, or bedroom success. One German curse roughly translates to, "May your loins go limp before your ale is warm." Ouch! Then again, women gave as good as they got. You overhear two wives chatting in a herb stall. One says he's too tired for love. The other snorts, "Funny, he's never too tired for pie." And in the background, a teenage girl rolling her eyes so hard it might qualify as exercise. Even manuscripts weren't safe. You peer over a monk's shoulder as he copies a psalm. In the margin, someone, likely a bored scribe, has drawn a tiny naked man chasing a butterfly with a very prominent nose. Elsewhere in the same book, a snail jousting with a phallus. Medieval marginalia wasn't just decoration. It was cheeky, weird, and often hilarious. Why? Some say it was a way to rebel quietly. Others think it helped monks stay sane during long hours of copying. But really, it's just another reminder. These were real people, real minds, real senses of humor. Sometimes, jokes took the form of test of manhood games. You find yourself watching two men in a village square trying to balance on one leg while reciting love poems. The loser has to wear a turnip around his neck for a week. Another time, it's a wrestling match over who can woo the widow. She's in on the joke, don't worry. The point is, intimacy wasn't just private, it was a public game, a source of gossip, a way to establish identity. Your status, your reputation, your sense of humor, all wrapped up in how you navigated desire and dignity. But sometimes, humor turned cruel. You pass a stocks where a young man sits, blushing, as children throw stale buns at his feet. His crime? Being caught climbing out of the midwife's daughter's window. The sign above him reads, Master of None. Brutal. But the laughter is now gentle. The punishment mostly symbolic. Because the Middle Ages were many things. Harsh, uncertain, deeply religious, but they were also surprisingly funny. Not always in ways we'd approve of today, but always rooted in the human need to poke fun at the things we fear, crave, or don't quite understand. So as you leave the tavern, a little buzzed on cider and snickering, you hear one last voice call out behind you. Why did the friar never marry? A pause. Because every time he found a good woman, she joined the convent. The room erupts in laughter. And just like that, another night of gossip, shame, and a lot of very bad poetry comes to a close.
The road winds upward now, gravel crunching beneath your boots as the hills stretch out before you. You pass quiet fields, distant silhouettes of grazing sheep, and eventually reach a large stone manor house, just as the sky turns lavender gray. A servant opens the creaky gate and gestures you inside. Tonight, you're entering the rarefied world of noble beds, political marriages, and air-making pressure, where desire often took a back seat to duty, and love had to ask permission before entering the room. You step into a hallway lined with tapestries. Stags leap through forests, angels hover in the clouds, and somewhere between them, two very awkward-looking people exchange wedding rings under the gaze of a dozen saints. The symbolism is clear. This is not about passion. This is about inheritance. In noble society, marriage wasn't for romance. It was strategy, a chess move, a treaty, a transaction. You didn't marry the person who made your heart flutter. You married the one who brought land, alliances, or money, preferably all three. And once married, your job was clear. Produce an heir, ideally a boy, ideally soon. You walk into a grand bedchamber now. Silken sheets, carved headboard, a massive canopied bed that looks like it belongs in a museum. A noblewoman sits at her dressing table, being braided and perfumed by maids. She looks calm, but you can sense the tension. It's wedding night, and while she may have only just met her new husband, he'll be joining her shortly. A midwife waits discreetly in the corner, holding a sheet. That's not a metaphor. In many noble households, consummation had to be witnessed, either through a trusted servant or through evidence collected afterward. A bloodstained sheet was sometimes displayed to prove virginity, fertility, and legitimacy. Romantic, no? Historians still argue how common this practice really was. Some records suggest it was mostly ceremonial. Others describe entire wedding nights attended by onlookers, laughing, toasting, offering advice. You wince? The couple probably did too. And if no blood appeared, the consequences could be dire. The bride might be accused of not being a virgin, or worse, a fraud. One infamous case involved a nobleman who annulled his marriage because his wife failed to bleed. She was humiliated publicly, though later proven innocent. The verdict?
She had an unusually robust constitution, whatever that means. But not every noble couple was doomed to cold beds and awkward glances. Some grew to love each other, eventually. Shared burdens helped. Running a household, surviving childbirth, fending off scheming relatives. One French duchess wrote of her husband, "He was a bore at first, but kind when it mattered." I suppose that is enough. High praise by medieval standards. You pass a chamber where an older noblewoman sits sewing quietly. Her marriage, arranged when she was 12, has lasted 30 years. Her husband snored. Her children are now grown. She hums softly, and when asked about romance, she says, "It comes when the expectations leave." For noblemen, the pressure was different. Produce sons, protect the bloodline, avoid scandal, but also discreetly enjoy the company of mistresses. Affairs were often tolerated, sometimes expected, as long as they didn't interfere with the family name. You peek into a garden alcove where a nobleman kisses a lady-in-waiting behind a rose bush. He'll likely return to his wife by dinner. She knows. She doesn't ask. But she watches, and the court watches with her, because everything in noble life was under scrutiny. Rumors could destroy reputations. One misplaced glance, one visit to the wrong bedchamber, and you could end up in exile, or worse, a monastery. A single noblewoman's pregnancy outside of marriage could derail an entire alliance. That's why some households employed chaperones whose sole job was to listen at doors. Yes, that was a real job. And for queens, the stakes were even higher. A queen's body wasn't her own. It was a vessel for dynasty. If she didn't conceive quickly, whispers began. Maybe she was barren. Maybe he was. Maybe the marriage wasn't being properly consummated. You hear this phrase whispered constantly in royal courts, often by people with very little proof and very large ambitions. When a queen finally gave birth, her chamber was filled with witnesses, noblewomen, priests, midwives, to confirm the baby was real, alive, and not smuggled in via a basket. One English queen was forced to deliver in a room with open doors so the court could peek in. You sigh. Privacy was for peasants. One French story tells of a duchess who pretended to be pregnant for 9 months while smuggling in a child from a servant. It worked, until the baby turned out to be left-handed. Apparently, the real father was ambidextrous. And yet, despite all this pressure, all this performance, some noble marriages thrived. Love blossomed in letters, in glances across banquet halls, in the quiet after ceremony. One countess wrote, "Though I was sold like bread, he treats me as cream." That might be the closest thing to a compliment in medieval poetry. You linger by the bedchamber door as another noble couple prepares to lie side by side. They speak softly. No servants, no witnesses, just two people bound by duty, trying to find peace in each other's presence. Because even in a world of strategy and scrutiny, love sometimes showed up anyway.
The castle walls begin to fade behind you as you make your way down into the winding alleys of a bustling medieval town. Cobblestones click beneath your feet. Shopkeepers shout half-heartedly into the dusk, and the scent of tallow smoke mingles with fish that probably should have been sold yesterday. You duck into a narrow side street, half curiosity, half instinct, and come face to face with a small painted sign. A red stocking, a tilted pitcher of ale, and what appears to be a goose wearing a bonnet. Congratulations, you found yourself at the front door of a medieval brothel. Because while noblemen plotted marriages and peasants whispered in haylofts, there was another, less acknowledged avenue for pleasure.
one that was regulated, taxed, occasionally scorned, but very much a part of everyday life. You step inside cautiously. The brothel is modest. Wooden floors, a fire crackling in the hearth, and women lounging in linen shifts. One plucks at a lute, another sips from a chipped cup of wine and winks at you. The madame, tall, no nonsense, and wearing more rings than you've seen in a chapel, gives you a quick nod. Windows for watching, coins for talking. In most medieval cities, prostitution wasn't hidden. It was managed. Towns like Paris, London, and Cologne had entire districts devoted to licensed brothels. Authorities allowed them, taxed them, and occasionally inspected them for hygiene or moral order. The idea was simple: better regulated sin than chaotic sin. A policy modern governments still wrestle with. You glance at the pricing chalked on a wooden board. It's surprisingly detailed. Services listed like a tavern menu. Some have a crown symbol beside them, denoting a noble clientele. Others, a pig's tail. You decide not to ask. But what's striking isn't the setup. It's the humanity. These women aren't silent shadows. They're working, earning, surviving. Some are here by choice, some by desperation, some because their options ran out a long time ago. One woman tells you plainly, better coin in this bed than none in a cold ditch. Then she gestures for you to pass her a comb. Historians still argue whether medieval prostitution was liberating, exploitative, or both. The truth is, as always, somewhere in between. In some cases, women in brothels had more control over their income than washerwomen or servants. In others, they were indebted to the madame, unable to leave. You pass a small room where a woman is carefully darning her own sleeves. Her client snores behind her, face down in the straw-stuffed mattress. She doesn't seem bothered. At least he paid first. Last week, one tried to pay in onions. Even the church, famously allergic to pleasure, took a complicated stance. Technically, prostitution was a sin, but practically, it was seen as a necessary evil. One prominent theologian even argued that without prostitutes, society would erupt in lustful chaos. You imagine the monk writing that while avoiding eye contact with everyone in the scriptorium. Some brothels were discreet. Others were loud and flamboyant. In Avignon, one was decorated entirely in blue silk and had a staff of 20 women. In London's Bankside district, they were known as the Stews and were regulated by the Bishop of Winchester, hence the nickname Winchester geese. No actual geese involved, thankfully. Probably. You pass a curtained doorway where two lovers talk quietly. Not a transaction, just conversation. Some women in brothels formed long-term arrangements with clients, becoming unofficial mistresses or kept women. These relationships could bring status and security, or scandal and heartbreak. And it wasn't just women. You're led to a side alley where a man in fine robes gestures subtly towards a small door. Male sex workers existed too, though less openly. Their clientele ranged from wealthy widows to men of all ranks. Official records rarely mention them, but whispered letters and court cases prove they were there, woven into the hidden corners of medieval intimacy. You sit at a window as night deepens and watch the rhythm of the place. Clients come and go, some sheepish, some smug. A few young men dare each other to knock, laughing nervously. One does, then immediately sprints away. Laughter echoes. The madame doesn't even blink. And yet, for all its routine, there's danger here. Women who aged out, became ill, or lost favor could find themselves on the street. Protection was inconsistent. Disease was rampant. Condoms did exist, made of linen or animal gut, but weren't common or reliable.
One surviving brothel ledger lists 12 sheaths as a major expense. You wonder how often they were reused. And then there's the risk of violence. Most brothels had house rules: no weapons, no drunkenness, no roughness. But enforcement? Spotty. And when trouble did happen, the law didn't always side with the women. Unless, of course, they had powerful clients. You pass by a painted wall showing Venus reclining with a dove on her shoulder. A recent addition, perhaps. It's cracked, but lovingly touched up. Someone here still believes in beauty, even amid commerce. Because in this world, intimacy isn't about flowers and fate. It's about money, needs, safety, moments, and sometimes kindness. You hear soft music from the hearthroom again. A new song. This one's less bawdy. A lullaby. Maybe something remembered from childhood. A voice carrying gently through the floorboards. A woman with tired eyes sings it, brushing her hair out in slow strokes. Not for a client, for herself. Because even in the oldest professions, even in places where love is bought by the hour, a little softness still lingers at the end of the day.
You step back out into the cool night air, the door to the brothel clicking gently shut behind you. The town is quieted. The moon casts long shadows across the cobbles, but not everything is still. From a nearby alley, you hear a low voice reciting something. Not a prayer, not a joke, something older, rhythmic. You follow the sound and discover an elderly woman drawing lines in the dirt with a small stick, chanting softly under her breath. Tonight, you're slipping quietly into the half-lit world of superstition, sin, and medieval guilt, where even the most intimate thoughts might require divine permission. The woman notices you watching and gestures you closer. Protect the house, protect the bed, protect the mind that wanders. She finishes her circle, tosses a sprig of thyme over her shoulder, and disappears into the dark like smoke. Because in medieval life, sex wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Every desire, every slip, every thought about desire was part of a larger cosmic system. Temptation, sin, penance, redemption. You walk through the doors of a church now. The space is cold and heavy with incense. Candles flicker. A statue of Mary gazes downward with unreadable eyes. In a side chapel, a confessional sits ready. Someone kneels, cloaked and quiet, whispering. I had thoughts, unclean ones, in the night. The priest listens, then responds gently. Say 10 Hail Marys, sleep with cold feet, do not lie with your wife until the feast of Saint Benedict. The penitent nods. The sin has been weighed, measured, forgiven, sort of. Because in the Middle Ages, thinking about sex could be a sin, not just acting on it. Lustful dreams? Sin. Temptation in your heart? Sin. Being too eager with your spouse? Surprisingly, also a potential sin. Theologians debated this endlessly. Was sex ever free of sin? Some argued that as long as it was for procreation, within marriage, and without pleasure, sure. Others said even then it was suspect. Necessary evil, they called it, like cabbage or taxes. One 13th century monk wrote that pleasure, even in marriage, should be endured, not enjoyed. You hope he was at least fun at parties. Historians still argue whether everyday people took this theology seriously or mostly rolled their eyes. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Church teachings loomed large, but the human body was persistent. You pass a cottage where a husband lies awake, staring at the ceiling. His wife snores gently beside him. He frowns, then crosses himself. Not tonight. It's Friday. It's penance. But he doesn't sound convinced.
To help the faithful navigate the labyrinth of morality, confession manuals were created, basically checklists for priests. These included questions like, did you lie with your wife on a holy day? Did you seek pleasure above duty? Did you provoke your spouse with excessive kisses? Excessive kisses. Imagine being told to tone it down by someone who's never kissed anyone. You stumble across a small booklet left behind in a merchant's study. Marginal notes are scrawled beside the printed questions. Lent? No. Easter Eve? Oops. Excessive? She didn't seem to mind. Not exactly saintly behavior, but very human. Then there were the remedies. If you were struggling with temptation, you could try fasting, cold baths, prayers. One manual suggests pressing ice to the loins. Another recommended keeping a crucifix in sight while embracing. You shudder. That sounds more awkward than holy. Some believers wore belts embedded with scripture verses. Others placed thorns under the mattress to discourage nighttime thoughts. One particularly pious man is said to have worn a hair shirt beneath his clothes, all the time. His wife was not thrilled. And when guilt became too much, pilgrimage. Travel was seen as purification. You pass a dusty road where a barefoot man walks slowly, rosary in hand. He whispers names, maybe sins, maybe memories. The shrine he's heading towards is 100 miles away, but the real journey is the one inside his own rib cage. You enter a small chapel where a woman sits alone before a candle. Her face is tense. In her hands, a prayer scroll, worn at the edges. She's weeping quietly, not for a sin done, but a sin feared. Because sometimes guilt arrived before the act, before the desire even took root. And the lines blurred further still for women. Medieval theology often treated female sexuality as both powerful and dangerous. A devout woman might worry that her desire could tempt a man into sin. So she dressed modestly, kept her voice low, even avoided perfume, just in case her presence sparked impure thoughts. One nun recorded feeling unclean after dreaming about a knight. She confessed to her abbess and fasted for 3 days. The abbess simply nodded and said, "The mind has many windows. Keep them shut." But despite all this tension, all this guilt, people didn't stop being people. You peek inside a farmstead where a couple holds hands before bed, whispering prayers, some real, some invented. He says, "Forgive us for loving in the wrong order." She replies, "Then let's sleep in the right one." And perhaps the most enduring superstition of all, that if you truly love someone, you would dream of them, not in sin, but in symbols. A red apple, a silverfish, a white stag. These dreams were said to be blessings, omens, messages from heaven that desire could be holy, if you just waited long enough. So as you leave the church, the confessional, the whispers of guilt and ghostly warnings, you return to your path through the sleeping town. You pass a man lighting a candle before a painted icon. His wife is standing behind him, already half asleep. He blows out the flame and takes her hand. "Tomorrow's a feast day," he murmurs. She smiles. "Then we have tonight."
You follow a winding dirt path out of the village proper now, the sound of your steps muffled by damp earth and scattered leaves. The trees close in gently overhead, and ahead of you stands a tall stone wall with ivy creeping up its sides. Just beyond it lies a quiet monastery. Lanterns glowing, bells long since stilled. You pass through the arched gate and step into a world where silence is sacred. Rules are ironclad, and yet desire doesn't vanish just because vows are spoken. Tonight, you're wandering through the solemn halls of celibacy, temptation, and cloistered complications. The courtyard is serene. Monks move through it like ghosts, robes swishing,
sandals whispering over stone. One pauses near a well, lifts a bucket, and catches your eye with a look that's less pious and more tired. You sense he's thinking about something that isn't prayer. Because even in monasteries, even behind thick walls and oaths of chastity, the human body continued to be a human body, and that meant occasionally thoughts wandered, hopes flickered, dreams drifted where they weren't supposed to. You slip into the scriptorium. Candles glow over parchment. A monk dips his quill in ink and continues copying a Latin text. His handwriting is flawless, but in the margin, barely noticeable, is a tiny doodle of a woman, hair long, eyes soft, a faint smile on her face. You raise an eyebrow. He coughs and turns the page. Historians still argue how often monks and nuns broke their vows in the Middle Ages. Some claim it was rare and overblown by gossip. Others say it was common enough that abbots had quiet, discretionary funds to handle the fallout, especially when pregnancies occurred. Yes, pregnancies, even in cloisters. You step into a quiet alcove where two nuns are sorting herbs. One lifts a handful of mint and says, softly, for clarity of thought. The other replies, or to hide the scent of sin. They don't laugh, but they do glance sideways at each other. There are records, plenty of them, of monks being caught in secret relationships, of nuns giving birth in secluded cells, of babies being left at convent gates. In one infamous case, a monastery near Cologne was forced to relocate after over a dozen of its nuns were found in the family way. The report simply noted a failure of discipline. Understatement of the century. But this wasn't always a matter of sneaking through shadows. Sometimes it was emotional intimacy that blurred the line. You sit in the cloister garden, watching a monk read beside a young novice. Their conversation is quiet, easy. He passes her a piece of parchment folded like a flower. She takes it, smiles, and presses it to her lips before hiding it in her robe. Is it love? Longing? Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. Because celibacy wasn't just about actions. It was about thoughts, intentions, dreams. You could sin in silence, in solitude. And when the silence became too heavy, some broke. You walk through the dormitory hall where monks sleep in narrow beds, each separated by a wooden partition. No doors, no locks. One man lies awake, whispering prayers. Another clutches a crucifix tightly, as if warding off something internal rather than external. One manual for novice monks warns, "Beware the devil who rides in dreams. He takes the shape of what you long for most." That's one way to interpret a midnight craving for companionship. The church responded in waves. At times, they tightened the rules. Curfews, more supervision, less time in the garden. Other times, they offered spiritual remedies. More fasting, more prayer, more confession. And when scandals broke, the punishments could be harsh. Expulsion, flogging, public penance, forced isolation. Still, humans are persistent creatures. One friar's diary includes a coded system for rating the appearance of visiting pilgrims. He writes, "Sister M. of York has a voice that would stir St. Joseph." He then adds, "I prayed twice that night." You're not sure if that's guilt or satisfaction. In some monasteries, same-sex intimacy quietly existed. Forbidden, certainly, but present. Shared quarters, shared secrets, shared loneliness. One letter between two novice monks reads like a love poem, full of longing and guilt, and a desire to run away together. It ends with, "I remain yours until the bells call us apart." You pause in the chapel. The air is thick with incense. A choir sings softly, Latin syllables echoing beneath stone arches. And yet, even here, desire doesn't disappear. It just gets disguised, wrapped in metaphor, hidden in psalms, whispered beneath robes and behind confession screens. One nun's diary contains dozens of hymns rewritten as love songs, not to Christ, but to a flesh-and-blood woman she once knew. She calls her my Eden before the fall. There's no mention of what happened to her, just a single line. She took the veil, and I took silence. Celibacy, in its truest form, wasn't just abstaining from sex. It was giving up the idea of physical connection entirely. No touches, no glances, no shared blankets or morning conversations. It was total solitude in the company of many. And that solitude could be heavy. You sit beneath a fig tree where an older monk writes poetry in the dirt. He hums to himself. The poem is about longing, but for what, you can't tell. The sun, the sky, a woman from long ago, or maybe just the comfort of being seen. Because that's the core of it, really. In a world where vows tried to suppress desire, what people often missed most wasn't sex, but connection. A hand on the shoulder, a voice calling your name, a body beside yours, warm and real, and silent. You leave the monastery slowly, steps echoing on the stone path. The bells toll softly in the distance. Inside, a monk extinguishes a candle and sighs. He whispers, "I dreamed of her again. May God forgive me."
You leave the monastery behind, its shadows clinging to your thoughts as the stars brighten overhead. The road widens now, winding past orchards heavy with ripening fruit. You follow the glow of scattered lanterns until you reach a field dotted with tents, bonfires crackling, and laughter floating like smoke on the wind. Because this is not a noble wedding, not a courtship confession, or a church-sanctioned union. This is a festival. And you've just walked into the blurred, beautiful chaos of May Day dances, mischief nights, and rituals that made the church very, very nervous. You pause at the edge of a clearing, where a maypole stands wrapped in ribbons, each a different color, each trailing from the hands of dancers circling and spinning in slow, hypnotic patterns. Laughter spills like honey from their mouths. Shoes are kicked off. Ale flows freely. And somewhere, just out of sight, a couple disappears into the woods. Welcome to the season of fertility. In much of medieval Europe, the arrival of spring wasn't just a celebration of sunshine. It was a celebration of life returning to the land and to the body. May Day, Midsummer, Beltane, if you're a bit farther north, whatever the name, these festivals pulsed with heat, music, and intention. You join the edge of the bonfire circle, where a group is singing a tune about a wandering plowman and the milkmaid who showed him where to sow. You raise an eyebrow. They don't mean turnips. And while the lyrics are cheeky, the beliefs underneath were deeply rooted. It was thought that engaging in intimacy during these sacred days, outdoors, under the stars, on freshly tilled earth, could bless crops, ensure fertility, or even protect against bad harvests. In some communities, greenwood marriages were common. Couples who joined hands during May Day, slept together that night, and then decided later whether to make it official. Historians still argue whether these were accepted trial marriages or just an excuse to let loose once a year. Either way, 9 months later, midwives in many villages noticed a suspicious baby boom. You wander through the festival and find a woman tying ribbons to a tree, each one representing a wish, a lover, or a name whispered into the bark. Another woman hums while pouring honey onto oatcakes. She offers you one and says, "Sweet dreams and sweeter company." You thank her, though you're not entirely sure that was about the cake. Nearby, couples leap over small fires, an old ritual meant to burn away barrenness. It was said that if you held hands tightly during the jump and didn't let go, your love would last the year. One young couple stumbles mid-leap.
lands laughing, and ends up tangled on the grass. Whether that counts as success or failure is anyone's guess. You overhear an elder muttering, "These nights bring more than dew." He doesn't sound angry, just amused. And it wasn't just rural folk. Even in cities, people celebrated Mischief Night or Carnival with masks, music, and a lifting of social norms. For a few hours or days, servants could tease their masters, women could wear men's hats, and desire could bloom where it pleased. A noblewoman might sneak off with a stable boy. A widow might take a second or third lover without judgment. As long as the sun rose the next morning and everyone returned to their roles, the slate was, unofficially, wiped clean. But not everyone approved. Church officials regularly tried to ban these festivals, or at least clean them up. One bishop wrote furiously about the fields of May becoming beds of sin. He then commissioned a sermon titled "Chastity in the Season of Blossoms." It was not well attended. Because, as one tavern keeper puts it, you can't tell the earth when to bloom. You just stand back and watch. Still, consequences weren't unheard of. Children born of these festivals, if left unclaimed, could end up in convent-run orphanages, or, in some areas, were quietly adopted by families who understood that the May moon doesn't judge. Some communities even held ceremonies to bless these babies, considering them gifts of the green. One woman, now old and wrapped in wool, tells you about the man she met at the midsummer bonfire 60 years ago. She said, "He said nothing all night, but handed me an apple and kissed my cheek. I married someone else, but I remember him every June." She pauses. "I planted apple trees after." You can't help but smile. Because this wasn't just about sex or celebration. It was about freedom. For one night, maybe two, people weren't sons or daughters, servants or superiors. They were bodies, beings, hearts beating to drums and footsteps and the rustle of leaves underfoot. You look up at the stars. Somewhere, a couple lies hidden in the wheat, breathing in unison. Maybe they'll marry. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll never even speak again. But for this moment, beneath this sky, they are seen, known, real. And in a world of arranged marriages, silent longing, and whispered guilt, that might be the closest thing to honest love. The bonfire crackles, the music slows, and you, dear wanderer, find yourself settling down on a blanket someone left behind. The grass is soft, the air is warm, and as the dancers blur into shadow, your eyes grow heavier, because sometimes the best stories end not with vows, but with a gentle exhale, the scent of honeysuckle, and a sky full of stars.
Morning tiptoes in slowly. Pale light creeping through the trees, dew clinging to your sleeves, and birds beginning their high, bright chatter. You rise from your borrowed blanket and stretch, bones cracking like dry kindling. The bonfire has gone to embers. The last of the dancers have wandered home, hand in hand or alone. But not all lovers sleep outdoors. You follow the winding trail back toward town, toward thatched roofs and chimney smoke, where a different kind of romance unfolds. Less firelight and fever, more routine, whispers, and lives quietly shared behind wooden doors. Because now you're stepping into the world of married life, where the sparks of intimacy often had to coexist with hard work, social expectations, and, let's be honest, a lot of livestock. You duck into a modest home where a woman stirs a pot over the hearth, and her husband sharpens a blade on the step outside. No drama, no poetry, just the day beginning. But the way they move around each other, wordless and easy, tells its own kind of love story. Marriages in the Middle Ages, especially among common folk, were more about partnership than passion. There wasn't much time for candlelit dinners when you had a field to till, a cow to milk, and 4 children clinging to your ankles. But that didn't mean affection was absent. It just looked different. You watch the wife slide a warm oatcake into her husband's hand without speaking. He breaks it in half and gives her the larger piece. No fireworks, but still, there's something there. A historian once called this practical tenderness, a kind of quiet intimacy built through trust, rhythm, and surviving winter together. And in bed? Well, let's just say the setting was rarely private. You peek into a sleeping loft shared by parents and at least 3 children, a grandparent, and possibly a goat. Intimacy had to be timed with great care. Often after the children fell asleep, or during early dawn when everyone else was still too cold or tired to notice. Sometimes beneath layers of blankets, with muffled laughter and well-practiced discretion. One cheeky proverb goes, "The rooster crows for morning, but the bed creaks for night." Interpret that however you please. Despite cramped quarters, or maybe because of them, couples found small ways to be close. A shared mug, a warm spot by the fire, a hand brushing another in the dark. And while sex within marriage was sanctioned by the church, it still came with rules. No intimacy on feast days, or fasting days, or Sundays, or the entire 40 days of Lent, or Advent, or while pregnant, or nursing, or just before communion. That left maybe 23 eligible nights per year, give or take. Historians still argue whether anyone actually followed this calendar or just nodded solemnly at confession and went about their business. Some couples did struggle with guilt or confusion, especially if they were deeply religious. Others navigated it with a bit of wink-wink naughtiness. One surviving letter from a 14th century farmer to his wife reads, "If tonight be not a holy day, then let it be our own." The margins have hearts drawn in them. You can almost hear her laughing. And for many, marriage was a safe harbor after years of uncertainty. You visit a cottage where a man gently massages his wife's shoulders after a long day weaving. She smiles, leans into the touch, and says, "Your hands are warmer than St. Martin's blessing." He grins because in this house, that is romance. But life wasn't all cuddles and kisses. There were disagreements, exhaustion, illness, miscarriages, infertility, long separations during seasonal labor. Love was tested by hardship, and sometimes it didn't survive. But when it did, it showed up in strange, lovely ways. A carved spoon, a repaired shoe, a husband who learns to help with spinning after his wife injures her wrist, a wife who tucks her husband's coat under her side of the mattress to keep it warm for the morning frost. Even the language of love was practical. One English poem records a wife telling her husband, "You are my roof in storm, my bread in lean times, my shade in sun." Beats a dozen roses, doesn't it? And still desire persisted. Older couples weren't immune to it. One parish record documents a pair in their 70s being caught in a most impassioned state by their grown children. The entry ends with,
They were fined for indecency and also admired for enthusiasm. You can't help but smile, because sex and affection weren't separate from the rest of life. They were tangled up in laundry, shared headaches, weather complaints, and inside jokes about chickens. They weren't sacred, they weren't shameful. They were just part of being together. You peek into another home where a mother nurses a baby while her husband plays a clumsy tune on a whistle to make the child laugh. His song is off-key, the baby giggles, the wife watches them both and mouths the words, "He's hopeless." But the way she says it makes it sound like home. And when one partner died, it left an emptiness that wasn't always loud, but always deep. One widower keeps his wife's scarf beside the hearth, neatly folded. He's remarried now. His new wife knows not to move it. Another woman sings her late husband's favorite song every night before bed, quietly, just the first verse. Love in the medieval home wasn't about passion that burned fast and bright. It was about embers, slow, steady, warm, long-lasting, enough to heat a lifetime. So, as you leave the village behind, climbing once more into the hills, you think of all those shared blankets, whispered jokes, and middle-of-the-night shuffles under two small quilts, and you realize that sometimes the most romantic thing in the world is simply someone remembering to close the shutters before the rain.
The wind picks up as you crest a hill, tugging at your cloak and sending loose strands of hay swirling around your boots. Below, the landscape opens into wild country, forests, moors, crooked streams with no clear path. You follow the road as it dips and narrows, the air colder now, the birds quieter. Ahead is a single house, alone in the trees, windows shuttered, smoke rising from the chimney in a lazy spiral. Welcome to the edge of the world, where the maps fade out and folklore takes over, where the rules of church and crown blur into something older, softer, stranger. Tonight, you're stepping into the shadowed realm of folk healers, herbal remedies, and love magic, a place where desire was shaped by superstition, whispered promises, and the contents of a wooden box buried under the hearth. You knock once, twice. A woman opens the door. She's older, with silver-streaked hair braided down her back. Her apron is stained, and her hands smell like rosemary and beeswax. She doesn't invite you in, exactly. She just steps aside. Inside, the walls are lined with jars, lavender, mugwort, crushed rose hips, powdered bark. Some are labeled in Latin. Others are marked with symbols you don't recognize. On the table, a bundle of twine, a candle, a loaf of bread, and what looks suspiciously like a lock of someone's hair. You found a cunning woman, a hedge witch, a healer, a midwife, or, depending on who's asking, a sorceress. In medieval life, when official channels failed, when the priest said, "Pray harder," or the doctor recommended leeches, people turned to the folk wisdom passed down in kitchens in cottages, especially when it came to matters of the heart. Because love, lust, and longing weren't just physical, they were magical, or at least potentially magical, if you had the right charm. You watch the woman grind dried herbs in a mortar. "For peace in the bed," she murmurs. She adds a drop of honey and a ribbon. "He's been distant," the client says. The healer nods. Men often are when Saturn's high. You're not sure if she's joking. Folk remedies for intimacy varied wildly, from sweet to
disturbing. One charm involved soaking bread in wine and placing it under your lover's pillow. Another recommended writing their name on your inner thigh and reciting a rhyme by moonlight. More alarming ones suggested putting powdered toad bones in soup. That one, let's not try. Historians still argue whether these were symbolic rituals, placebo comfort, or acts of quiet rebellion by women who had no other power over their lives or bodies. But what's clear is this: belief mattered. If you believed the poppy seeds stirred into your porridge would rekindle desire, maybe they would. If you buried a coin beneath the bed to draw passion back into your marriage, and it worked, who's to say it wasn't real? You sit beside the fire, where a younger woman stirs a pot of honey, clove, and cinnamon. She says it's for a couple too shy to speak their feelings. This'll loosen tongues, she grins, then adds a splash of ale. For flavor, surely. Some clients wanted love, others wanted protection. A charm made from mistletoe and ash was said to guard against unwanted advances. Another, carried in a linen pouch, was meant to ensure mutual satisfaction. No one says how it worked or whether it did. And of course, there were curses. You pass a basket covered in cloth. Inside, 2 poppets tied together with red string, their faces marked with wax. She took him, someone mutters. This will take him back. The healer sighs. Love forced is love soured. This'll sour it for her too. Not exactly a fairy tale ending. You flip through an old grimoire, pages cracked, ink fading, filled with instructions for securing affection and awakening sleeping passions. One involves rosewater and apples. Another suggests whispering a secret into a knotted cord. A third includes owl feathers, which feels excessive. And these practices weren't limited to women. You find a carved talisman in a drawer. A man's handwriting, messy, pleads, "Let her see me with softer eyes." He must have believed the charm could help, or at least hoped. Because magic in these moments was often just hope with ingredients. Even within the church, tensions brewed. Clerics warned against love potions, calling them sinful, dangerous, even demonic. But they often turned a blind eye, especially if the potion in question contained only harmless herbs. And even clergy sometimes visited cunning folk discreetly. One record tells of a monk who bought a charm to cure nightly restlessness. The healer didn't ask questions, but the charm included valerian root, crushed rose petals, and a ribbon from the novice he secretly adored. Romantic? Maybe. Doomed? Definitely. You step outside as dusk returns. The healer ties a sprig of rue to your sleeve. For clarity, she says, and to keep you from speaking your heart when you ought to keep it quiet. You laugh. She doesn't. Words have teeth, she warns, especially the soft ones. And she's right. Love charms didn't guarantee happiness. They weren't always safe, but they gave people agency. In a time when marriage was arranged, options were limited, and feelings weren't always welcome. So, whether it was a pinch of thyme under the pillow, a whispered name into smoke, or a ribbon tied to a tree branch, these were acts of longing, of reaching, of saying, "I want something more," and not waiting for permission to ask. The fire inside the cottage flickers once, then dims, and you continue down the road, the scent of clove still clinging to your sleeve, wondering if someone, somewhere, once tied your name to a poppet and hoped you felt it in your chest. Maybe you did.
The road grows quieter now, softer beneath your feet, as moss overtakes the path and the forest closes in with damp hush. Somewhere behind you, the villages are asleep. Even the birds have gone still. And yet, the night feels watchful, like it remembers things long buried. You step carefully over a fallen log and find yourself at the edge of a graveyard. Stone markers lean at odd angles, worn smooth by centuries of wind and lichen. Some are simple, just names and dates. Others are ornate, carved with angels, roses, or occasionally a heart split by lightning. Because not every love story ends in marriage, and not every kind of desire found its place in the open daylight. Tonight, you're descending into the quiet, complex stories of forbidden love, same-sex desire, and the people history tried to forget. A crow startles as you pass, flapping off into the trees. You reach a bench near an old chapel wall and sit, brushing aside a tangle of ivy. On the stones behind you, graffiti, centuries old, still clings in faded ink. He touched my hand. I felt the sun. Not exactly scandalous, unless, of course, it was him writing about him. The Middle Ages weren't particularly tolerant of same-sex intimacy, at least not officially. Church doctrine labeled it unnatural, sinful, or a grave offense. Punishments ranged from public penance to imprisonment, sometimes even death. And yet, it happened. Because it always happens. Where there are people, there is love and desire and risk. You walk past a crumbling headstone marked with 2 initials, intertwined vines carved between them. No last names, just M+E 1312. A record found in a nearby court document references the unnatural affection of 2 clerks, Martin and Elias, punished with exile. Were these their names? Did they flee together? Historians still argue about how prevalent same-sex relationships were in medieval Europe. Records are scarce, often vague or buried under euphemism. But letters survive, poems survive, and some stories slip through the cracks of time. You find one in a merchant's ledger, tucked beneath a stone, a page filled not with prices, but with verse. A man writing about another man's smile, about the way he laughed when wet with rain, about sharing bread and a secret. No names, just feelings. And there were women, too. In convents, same-sex affection could flourish under the guise of spiritual friendship. They called it sisterly devotion, but sometimes those bonds ran deeper. Some nuns wrote love poetry to each other, full of longing and metaphor. One nun wrote, "Your kiss lingers in my psalms." Subtle, yes, but unmistakable. A 12th century abbess once confessed in a letter never meant to be public that she feared falling into her arms more than into sin itself. The recipient? Another abbess. No reply survives. You walk toward a low hill where 2 trees grow unusually close together, roots tangled. A local legend says 2 women were buried here after being caught sharing a bed and refusing to repent. The story goes they were hanged at dawn, but the trees still lean toward each other. And not all forbidden love was about gender. Sometimes it was about class. A nobleman and a farmhand, a widow and a young scribe, a monk and a married woman. You find their stories scribbled in margins, tucked into wills,
hinted at in ballads sung quickly and quietly. One such ballad drifts to your ears now, sung by a drunk fiddler stumbling down a nearby road. It tells of a brewer's daughter who ran off with a knight's wife. They took the stars and left their names, the chorus goes, and danced past every law. Love that stepped outside the lines, whether of class, gender, or marriage, was often punished, but it also persisted, because rules could police actions, but not hearts, not fully. You kneel beside a grave bearing no name, only a symbol, a pair of clasped hands carved deep in the stone. A parish record notes it as the grave of two companions, drowned while fleeing the city in disgrace. Whether they were lovers or just loyal friends, no one knows, but someone buried them together. Someone carved those hands. And the silence that surrounded these stories, it wasn't always shame. Sometimes it was protection. A mother who doesn't ask where her daughter goes every Tuesday. A priest who hears a young man confess strange thoughts and simply nods, saying, "Pray and be gentle with yourself." Not all love was accepted, but not all love was condemned either. There were places where people whispered yes instead of no. You recall a record from a remote village in the Pyrenees. Two women listed as shared tenants for over 30 years. No mention of husbands, just their names, side by side, on the tax roll. No scandal, no fuss, just together. You stand now, brushing dew from your sleeves, and look around the graveyard one last time. So many stories lie here, some known, most not, and all of them mattered to someone. One final note catches your eye, tucked in the crook of a headstone. We kissed only once. It was enough for a lifetime. Still, I'd do it again. It's unsigned. Maybe that's the point. Because not all love gets to shout. Some of it survives by whispering. And sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that linger the longest.
The sky begins to gray now, that soft blue hush before dawn, when even time seems to hesitate. You step away from the graveyard and find yourself walking toward the highest point on the horizon, a rocky hill where the wind picks up, restless and wide. Below, the world stretches out in sleeping fields and soot-streaked chimneys. But up here you're crossing into myth, because tonight's path ends with the stories people whispered when no one was supposed to be listening. Tales of saints, sinners, seducers, and monsters. Welcome to the realm of medieval legends about lust, punishment, and things that go bump in the boudoir. You sit beneath an old yew tree as the wind rustles its branches. A tattered bit of parchment flutters by, caught in a root. Someone's handwritten story, maybe once part of a sermon. You smooth it out and begin to read. Of the knight who burned for desire and the demon who took his shape. Oh, we're going there. Because not all tales of intimacy were romantic. Some were cautionary. Many were fantastical. All were soaked in symbolism, superstition, and a healthy dose of don't you dare. Take the tale of the succubus, a beautiful woman arriving at night, offering pleasure beyond imagination, only to steal your life force or your soul by morning. She was used to warn monks about temptation, to scare young men into chastity, and, occasionally, to explain a certain kind of recurring dream. One monk wrote, "She visited me thrice. I woke cold and empty, but also quite pleased, honest if not helpful." Then there were the incubi,
male demons who preyed on sleeping women. They could be seductive or terrifying depending on the storyteller. Some even blamed mysterious pregnancies on them, when no fathers stepped forward. Convenient, if a bit awkward to explain to the midwife. Historians still argue whether these legends were metaphor, psychological explanation, or cultural attempts to make sense of trauma and desire. The truth? Probably some blend of all three. You pick your way around a circle of stones, once part of an ancient shrine, now home to moss and badger tracks. Here, villagers used to tell the story of a maiden who fell in love with a fairy knight. He visited her every midsummer, bearing gifts and kisses and promises. But when she asked for a real life together, he vanished. You cannot bind what isn't mortal, the tale ends. Bit of a downer. Yet, the warning was clear. Desire could lead you away from safety, away from hearth and home, into woods, into trouble, into yourself. Some stories were darker still. A nobleman obsessed with the servant girl prays to Saint Margaret for strength. When none comes, he makes a deal with the devil. He gets her love for 7 years, then fire claims the manor, and both are never seen again. Moral? Don't make pacts. Or maybe don't confuse obsession for love. Still, not all legends punished desire. You hear the faint melody of a ballad drifting on the wind. A shepherd sings about a queen and her maid who escaped their arranged marriages by fleeing into the hills. They lived as hermits, the story says, raising goats and writing poetry. It ends with, "The mountain kept their secret and the flowers grew brighter where they slept." You smile. Not all love needs a wedding to be worth remembering. You wander past the stone bench carved with runes. Local legend says it was once part of a trial site where women accused of lustful magic had to sit through the night. If the bench was warm in the morning, they were guilty. Never mind the fire pit conveniently nearby. One guilty woman reportedly spat in the judge's face and said, "If warmth be wickedness, may your own wife condemn you." She was pardoned. Or at least no one recorded what happened next. You crouch by a puddle, catching the first hints of sunrise. Ripples form, though no stone falls. Superstition says that water can hold memories, that if you whisper a forbidden name into it, the reflection will answer back. You try. Nothing. But still, you wonder. In these tales, intimacy was rarely neutral. It was divine or dangerous, holy or cursed, tamed or wild. There was no just anything. And sometimes even saints had stories. One popular tale features Saint Agnes, who vowed to remain a virgin. A nobleman tried to seduce her. She refused. He died on the spot. She prayed, brought him back, and still refused. The moral wasn't subtle. Holiness conquers lust. Also, don't annoy saints. Another story tells of a pious monk who fell in love with a village girl. Rather than break his vow, he threw himself into a river. Miraculously, he survived, and she became a nun. Happy ending? Hard to say, but they reportedly exchanged letters until death. Tender, tragic, and very wet. And yet, even in these old tales, you catch flickers of humanity. A longing to be seen, to be wanted, to be remembered, whether as legend or lover or just the name carved into a stone no one visits anymore. The yew tree creaks behind you. A breeze lifts your hood, and you hear something, soft, low, familiar. A lullaby? No, just the wind through the reeds. Still, it feels like someone telling a story, maybe about a boy who loved another boy, a girl who kissed a ghost, a couple who left the village and never came back, but were said to be happy wherever they went. Stories like those don't end. They just change shape. They drift between campfires, sermons, and daydreams. They're told in wine-sweetened whispers, scribbled in margins,
buried with ribbons, held in the mouth like honey, too dangerous to say out loud, too beautiful not to.
The sun edges up over the horizon now, slow and sleepy, casting long orange fingers across the fields. You walk down from the high hilltop, your feet softer now, your breath quieter. The world begins to stir around you. Plows creak, roosters crow, shutters open with slow, reluctant groans. But your path leads not back to town, not to another church or hearth. No, your last stop is inward, because now we turn to the most hidden, least recorded, most complicated place of all, the space inside the medieval mind, the quiet corner where thoughts turned into feelings, where longing brushed against fear, and where people wrestled with the question, am I allowed to want this? You wander into a walled garden, half wild, half tended. Roses grow in spirals, lavender spills over the path, and a small fountain gurgles in the center. This, they used to say, was the place where a person might contemplate love, not as action, but as nature. In medieval texts, love was often categorized like a botanical chart. Courtly love, marital love, lust, charity, spiritual passion, each one blooming from a different part of the soul, requiring different care, offering different risks. And it wasn't always clear which was which. You sit on a stone bench beside the fountain. On the rim, scratched faintly into the stone, are 3 Latin words: amor, timor, and fervor, love, fear, and heat, a trinity that sums up the entire experience rather neatly. For all the sermons and manuals and whispered warnings, medieval people still felt the same knots we do: the ache of attraction, the flutter of a glance, the quiet panic of being noticed by the person who shouldn't be looking at you, but is. And when they couldn't speak it out loud, they wrote. In poems, in prayers, in psalms rewritten by candlelight, a knight scrawled a line on his saddle: she walks beneath my ribs. A merchant tucked a verse into a ledger: the cost of missing you exceeds all coin. A nun penciled her name beside a painted angel and then scratched it out again. Historians still argue whether these were confessions, dreams, or just emotional graffiti. But the fact that they survive at all, that matters. You run your hand along a low wall covered in moss. Beneath it, old tiles formed the shape of a broken heart, mended with gold. Someone went to the trouble to fix it, to make it visible. Because even when no one said it out loud, love was everywhere. In stained glass, in tapestry corners, in lullabies, in the way someone saved the last bite of bread. But it was also lonely. For many, desire meant silence, shame, secrets folded into clean linens. You picture a woman lighting a candle for a man who never returned, a man sleeping in a bed beside someone he never chose, a young person praying not for love, but to stop loving. Still, sometimes the silence cracked. You recall a letter passed from one monk to another, short, almost childish. If I see you today, I will forget to look away. It's unsigned, but kept. Or the childless couple who carved each other's initials into the beam above their bed, not for others to see, but for themselves, a reminder. We are here, together. That's enough. Desire in the medieval world wasn't just about sin or duty or passion. It was about presence, the moments between, the look before the kiss, the space between fingers before they touch. And often it lived only in the imagination. You pass a young woman sketching something in the dirt with a stick. She erases it before you can see, but her smile lingers. Some fantasies were never meant to be fulfilled. They were soft places to rest, to hope, to feel alive, in a world that often demanded quiet compliance. And in that way, desire became a form of resistance, to imagine more than what was allowed, to feel in a world that said don't,
to want and not apologize, to dream. So as you step back out of the garden, the last of the petals brushing your hands, you realize something simple and ancient. Love, real or imagined, whispered or written, holy or messy, has always been there. In every dark chapel, every market square, every wooden bed frame, every clasped hand. Not always easy, not always fair, but there, just like now. The village is waking up. A child runs down the path, chasing a rooster. A couple share a crust of bread, bumping shoulders. Somewhere nearby, a candle is lit, not for a saint, but for someone missed. And you? You keep walking. Back into the world a little fuller, a little softer, carrying the stories of people who wanted, who hoped, who reached, just like you do. Because even in the most boring corners of history, love never left. It just wore simpler clothes.